I drew on a sort of a wide ethnographic inquiry. And part of that inquiry, I drew on several methods, including participant observation, semi-structured interviews, focus groups, and also a discourse analysis, and also photo narratives. With participant observation, especially since it was at 2 community centers and it is young people, I think one of my main ethical issues was it is a transient population. They would, come in and come out of the space. Sometimes you'll see a face that you'll never see again. So just from a very practical, ethical standpoint, you're always worried, well, do they know my role here, right? I mean, you try to announce yourself ever so often, but you're always worried, well, do they know? And if they did know, would they behave themselves differently? So that's a very practical, ethical issue. The methods I used for the study were participant observation, semi-structured interviews, focus groups, discourse analysis, and photo narratives. The use of multiple methods were important because I wanted to get a comprehensive or a more holistic view of young people's sense of belonging and how they negotiate citizenship. And I wanted, a lot of the research, and I discussed the quantitative research, but a lot of research with young people and citizenship especially is usually centered around doing interviews. So I wanted a more everyday sense of how they, negotiate these things in their everyday, and I think the best way to do that is to use several methods to get different viewpoints. Participant observation for me, I spent 16 months in the field. I was at 2 community centers. Initially, I had thought of just going to the centers and just not going to the centers and just sort of hanging around the community center and to see how young people were engaging with each other and engaging with the social workers at the space. I soon came to realize that, especially when you work with young people, it's like I mentioned before, it's very transient. I wasn't getting rich data. If I came, they would kind of like scurry away, or not scurry away, but they would, not behave in the way, they probably would if I wasn't there. So I found the best approach for me, at least, was to work with them in a program settings. So both centers would offer many programs, and I think that sense of a bit of structure actually helped me in my research because, they were in a room, they were doing activities, and part of the activities they would be having conversations that I might not be able to have if I'm just in the lobby, trying to hear the kind of conversations they're having, which I also did. So most of the time, I did have a notebook with me, which they didn't find odd because a lot of the young people that would come to the programs would have their own notebooks, or they were provided notebooks, especially in the rap program and the slam poetry program. So I always had my notebook with me, but I wouldn't write notes most of the time in front of them. I felt it was, personally for me, I felt uncomfortable. I felt the outsider-insider divide was, was too big if I did it that way. I felt they were kind of uneasy and they started kind of monitoring themselves, and I don't think they felt like they didn't want to be these lab rats, right? So I wanted the research to be as natural as possible. So most of the time I would come home immediately and write up my notes. If they were doing activities, for example, they were writing in their journals or writing poems, or doing the rap lyrics, I would take notes then because they wouldn't think I was doing that. So that I would just record everything, even if I didn't think it was important. I would just write it down. I found many interesting things. So they would watch YouTube, and most of the time they would watch rap videos. What I found really interesting is they would watch rap videos from the early 2000s, so when I was like at their age and listening to that music. So I thought that was really interesting. I remember this one boy, and he stands out to me for whatever reason. He was wearing all blue, and he had like a red bandana on. And I remember when I was growing up, like, you wouldn't wear red and blue together, right? Just for, you know, things that were considered gang affiliation had now, you know, taken on a different meaning. So there's things always happening. It was such a youthful space, so there's just things always happening. Why I chose photo narratives is, you know, ideally, you know, you read these great ethnographies where the person, you know, follows the participants to their house, and, you know, they get to live with them and, you know, kind of really get to know them at that level. You know, obviously for ethical reasons, these are young people. I couldn't, you know, go into their homes whenever I wanted, especially when they lived with their parents. So there's, you know, that extra level of authority I would have to negotiate. So I wanted to get an understanding of, well, how do young people, you know, negotiate belonging and sense of citizenship outside of these kind of confined spaces? And, you know, I realized that, you know, the best way I could do was to take a photo narrative approach, where I gave each of the participants a disposable camera, and then they went out into their community and into their homes, and then they took pictures, and then they came back and we had interviews regarding the pictures that they took. First, getting the young people. So I decided to do it at one of the community centers, which caters to a public housing complex. So these were especially marginalized young people, particularly, you know, impoverished, and much more so than I would say the other community center I was working with. So I had decided to do the project with them just for practical reasons and what was happening at the time. And I wanted to give them a week. I was going to give them the cameras. First, I was going to ask them, you know, most of them all have cell phones, which they're always taking pictures with. So I was going to ask them, you know, you have a choice. You can either take it with your own phones, or I'll give you disposable cameras, just, you know, for the people who didn't have phones. They all wanted to use the disposable cameras. They had, like, these people are really young, right? They hadn't even seen camera. They didn't even know what film was. So they were very excited about using disposable cameras. So I wanted to give them a week. The youth workers, so in this particular program, there's about 10 youth. There's minimum of 2 social workers and at least 3 volunteers. So you can see it was a very high needs group. So when I approached them first to get the okay for the project, they said, everything's great, we like it, but we advise you not to give them the camera for a week, because they're like, you're either never going to see them again, or you're going to get pictures that you don't want to get. So I was very curious at what they meant about these pictures, but, you know, I had to go through that level of authority. So I agreed that we wouldn't give them for a week. So they said the program was about 3 hours. So they said, and the center was right in the community. It's like 10 steps away from their home. So they said, you know, we'll give them 3 hours, and they can venture out in the community, go into their homes, and take, you know, all the pictures that they wanted, and which they did. And then they went out and they took many pictures, and they came back. I took the pictures, I got them developed, and then the following week I did, some of the girls in the group wanted to do an interview just with the girls. They didn't want the boys with them. So I did 1 or 2 interviews, 2 sets with just 2 pairs of girls, and then I did the boys all in 1 focus group. At home, I had taken all the pictures. I had, you know, sorted through them, and I had on the back of the pictures written out questions about why, what made them want to take these pictures. You know, I had sent them out asking, you know, how would you define, what does your community mean to you, and how do you, you know, what's belonging to you, what makes you belong in the community. So once I got the pictures back, I, you know, had further questions, and then when they came back, I asked them, you know, why they took certain pictures. I got to see, obviously at a different level than just reading or hearing about it, I got to see the things that they experience on a day-to-day basis, captured, of course, in a time and space. So, for example, you know, I'd done a few focus groups with this group before, and other youths at this community center, and they'd all talked about essentially that this community was under a police state, that there was police, and even when I went to the community center, there was a police car there every week. Every day I would see a police cruiser. So they would always tell me, oh, you know, they harass us, the police are always harassing us, they won't let us be, and, you know, if we play basketball, whatever we do, they're trying to provoke us, they want to get us, like, in a fight with them. And, you know, you hear it, that's one thing, but when I actually saw them take pictures of the police cruisers, or pictures of them, you know, sticking up their middle finger to the police cruiser as it's driving by, or, you know, since it's a public housing units, they have these signs up around the community, saying things like no loitering, no playing cards, no playing dominoes, and these are official, you know, city sort of bylaws, or, you know, whatever laws for the community centers. So to actually see them taking pictures of this, it confirmed to me how important this is in their everyday life. And when they say that they are, you know, over-policed and under constant surveillance, to actually see it, I don't think any other method could have captured it in this particular way. There is many themes that came out. One, this idea, you know, so this research was done in 2013 to 14. And there's a lot of talk, especially in the community with the community housing, a lot of talk about over-policing and police harassment. And I think at that time that wasn't really on the radar. I mean, now police carding is, you know, very much in the news, but just even 2 years ago, this is kind of something that was happening in these communities all the time, but no one paid attention, right? It's only when you know, it starts happening outside these communities does it start getting the attention that it does. So I think the police presence in young people's lives really structure their sense of belonging. You know, I remember this so well, one of the boys in the group, you know, I asked him, you know, does he feel Canadian? Does he feel like he belongs? And he simply said, how can I feel I belong when the police harass me every day, right? So if they didn't, maybe I would, right? So I think that was a major theme for me. Another theme is, you know, I spoke to a lot of adults too in both community centers. And sometimes, especially in the public housing, they would try to distance themselves from these communities, right? Like, oh, we're just here until we can make it out, or, you know, we're just here temporarily, or, you know, we're just going through some things. But young people took great pride in being in these neighborhoods. They weren't ashamed. They wore these neighborhoods with great pride. You know, sometimes it was a bad thing, right? They thought, you know, they kind of conformed to these ideas of these are dangerous neighborhoods to mean, you know, they can go to school and, you know, scare other kids because I come from this and this neighborhood. But those were the small minority. But for most people, they were happy and they were pride, and they had great sense of belonging. They weren't apathetic. They were finding so many different ways to engage in.